Cool, so I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about myself here. All right, so currently working as a consultant for Ansible, specializing in automated network devices. A little bit about my past. My most recent job before this one was at Level 3. You guys are familiar with the large ISP that was recently bought by CenturyLink. No longer actually exists, but previous to that, I spent some time at a small wireless ISP in Loveland, which was called Skybeam, which is now called Rise Broadband. So the cool thing about them is they actually use microwave backhauls. So they're not actually using fiber in the ground, they're using radios. So you can imagine they have a radio on like a water tower in Erie or something, right? It shoots over to Pocono, and then maybe that shoots over to Longmont. And you can build these networks like that. Let's see here. So a lot of my tasks as a network engineer were things like building that wireless radio network, deploying new sites. So let's say they had the interest in maybe selling some internet services in a new town. So let's say like Longmont. Well, we would identify maybe a new tower. So I have a little picture of some wireless backhauls on a tower here. We would find a tower. We could put something like this dish on here, and then we would have to deploy one of these switches, something like this, like a 3560, 3550 multi-layer Cisco switch, right? Put that at the bottom of the water tower, and then sort of build that site out. Make a port for whatever batteries you have on site, right? Make a port for the field guys to be able to connect to the internet, if they're on site. Make a port that maybe goes up to one of these wireless backhauls, or maybe 2 or 3 of them. That's going to feed that site. And then also you'd have some access points that kind of spread out from there, and maybe shoot to some residential houses. So things like that, deploying configuration changes. So a couple of examples I have here. I don't know how familiar you guys are with networking, and how many of you might be like Linux guys that came to hear about Ansible, but on some little multi-layer Cisco switches like this, you have something called an SDM template. And what that is you can set it to either like a layer 2 or a layer 3, right? If you set it for layer 2, you can have a ton of VLANs on there, but you have less room for routes, right? If you set it for a layer 3 template, you have more room for routes, less room for VLANs, okay? So just a little example of one of the first things I was sort of tasked to do that inspired me to get into network automation was they said, hey, we've actually been running on the layer 2 template on all of our switches, and we're running out of room for routes. And so you can come in during the maintenance window for the next 3 months and just change like a couple of these every night. That'd be great, right? So, I had at that time started taking a free Python for Network Engineers course from a guy named Kirk Byers. If some of you guys have heard of him. And so I said, well, rather than spending the next 3 months coming in at midnight and leaving at 6 in the morning, why don't I try to just automate this and just do this all in like one day, right? So I wrote a little Python script that changed the SDM template on all the switches, right? And I said, well, let me try this on my lab, and okay, well that seems like it worked. We try it on one of the switches in the field. Okay, that worked. We try it on 5 switches, and then I continually sort of rolled it out 5 at a time because back then if something broke, I'd have to wake up a field guy and say, can you get in your truck and drive over to Erie and climb to the top of that water tower and unplug my switch for me? And they didn't like that kind of stuff, right? So it wasn't like, hey, it's a manned data center, I'll just call the guy who's on shift. It wasn't like that, right? So I even had one situation where there was a guy and there was a tower up on the top of a mountain. And I was doing a cutover one night, and he's like, hey, I think I see a mountain lion over there looking at me. It's like 2 in the morning. Well, maybe you should just go back to your truck. So once all this, once the sun comes up. So that was one of the first things that I automated. The next thing that came along was they had an access list that they wanted updated, and they said, hey, can you roll this up to all 300 switches one at a time? And I said, well, let me write a script. So that was pretty cool. That was a small ISP, so I basically had free reign. After that, I was recruited by level 3, and I quickly learned that they do things differently at these larger ISPs, and I can't just write Python scripts and automate everything. There's a whole department that decides what I'm allowed to do. Like there's 400 people in the building somewhere that can tell me no. So I really, really enjoyed working there because I got to have a lot of hands-on experience automating this stuff. So fast forward a little bit. So I started using Python and then Expect. And Kurt Byers started talking about Ansible. And then lo and behold, like a year and a half ago, on Ansible 2.1, Ansible released network compatibility. So they now have modules for most of the large network vendors, so Cisco, Arista, Juniper. And I happen to have my trusty CCNA lab at my house. So I said, hey, let me try to figure this stuff out, right? So I started writing some small playbooks and automating some things on these switches. So Ansible can drastically improve the job of network engineers. Some of the stuff I talked about. Some of the other things it can do is, so like at level 3, I worked the graveyard shift, which is actually the best one because you're the guy that's actually doing all of the maintenance, right? Everything that needs to be done in the middle of the night, so they don't take down any customers. And one of the things I noticed was some of these high-level network engineer guys would hand down these things called mocks, right? And it's basically like, hey, I need to type this in on this router and this on this router, and this is the change we're going to make during this cutover. It wasn't peculiar to see some mistakes in those sometimes that got handed down, and you're kind of put in a strange spot because now it's the middle of the night. Maybe you see a mistake in this mop. You certainly can't call the guy and ask him because he's sleeping, right? So now you have to make the decision. Here's this high-level network engineer guy, and here's me, this knock guy, right? Trying to get to that position one day. Do I override what this guy wrote in here, right? Even because I can clearly see this. Maybe this is going to cause a loop, or this is going to cause a problem in our network, right? So if you think about it, with Ansible, what you could actually do is write a playbook for this mop. You could test it in a test network, verify that it acts and gives you the results that you want to see, and then you could just give that playbook to your NOC engineer, and then he can just run the playbook. So it kind of takes away room for a lot of mistakes there. Some of the other things you can do is provisioning of new devices, which I'm going to do a little demo on after this. So not only config changes, but another thing you can do is run reports. So if your boss asks you, how many of our switches are on the old iOS version and how many are on the new, I can write a playbook that can tell you that in a matter of like 2 minutes and run it on everything in the whole network in 2 more minutes, and then in 5 minutes I can type that into a file and give it to my boss and say, here you go. These are all the ones we need to change. Whereas, back in the day, that was a lot of Excel spreadsheets. Well, let me see, and who knows if that's filled out correctly. So running reports is another thing. So widespread config changes, of course, like I mentioned, if you have an access list and you have maybe once a month they want to add a new subnet in there, that's something you could add on 300 switches at once, pretty simply. So a lot like I talked about, the overnight maintenance windows, they can be written with multiple tasks to change configurations on routers. They can be tested, and then the overnight NOC technicians can execute these playbooks rather than following like a complex wiki or I don't know how many of you guys have gone through the pain of following a wiki that someone else has written. Right? We all think differently, and to that person, that wiki makes total sense. But to you, you're like, well, I don't think that way, right? So a lot of the cool things about it is you can have human readable names for these tasks, right? So not only is this NOC technician going to be able to run this thing that you've written, but they're actually going to be able to follow along. So you can name these tasks something that's very easily followed along with and understood. So this is like some SNMP playbook that I wrote. So you can see right here, it's setting a community string. It's setting the source as loopback 0, setting the contact info. So if it fails on one of these, and you do have to call that engineer who wrote this, you're not going to say, hey, it broke. You're going to say, hey, it actually made it through setting the community string, but it didn't set the contact info. It gave you this error, right? So you can sound like you know a little bit about what you're talking about. With provisioning of new devices, without automation, configurations are manually entered, and I've definitely gone through this a lot myself. So, the process we used to have is we had a Word document, and it had all these configs in there. And so what you would do is you'd go get your switch out of the box, and you'd maybe set up SSH connectivity to it, and then you'd paste in the stuff from this Word document. And if you ever pasted something from a Word document, you know that the formatting doesn't always work, and then so you accidentally didn't put one of those lines in, and you can't really see it because you're looking at a giant running config. So you think it's all set up great. You hand it to the field guy. He calls you at 3 in the morning. He plugs all the cords in, turns it on, and it doesn't come up with network connectivity. And I'm like, oh man. And then 3 hours later, you finally figure out like, oh, this one line didn't get pasted correctly, right? So errors can be minimized. And I'm actually going to give you guys an example. I wrote an Ansible role that's on GitHub, and we're gonna execute that on these 4 switches, and it's going to put a large base config on there. So some of the other cool things that are going on in this space right now, I was kind of hoping that Scott Lowe would be here because he did a demo on Napalm at the last NPLUG meeting. But Napalm is something that's pretty cool. It's actually network automation and programmability abstraction layer with multi-vendor support, right? Almost as cool as Rancid. So this playbook right here utilizes the Napalm module for installing a config, and it does it a little differently. If you have the archive feature on your Cisco switches, you can actually write this file directly to the flash. And it'll do a diff on the running config file, and then put in whatever configs are missing. So if you do start getting interested in this kind of stuff, I think you'll find that pretty cool. You can do some other stuff too, as far as doing the programmability abstraction and stuff like that. So if you're getting deep into programming, that stuff can be handy. So as far as running reports. So the standard output of any combination of show commands can be exported to a text file. So it's very simple. So all you would really need to do is enter a register command in your playbook or in your role, and now we create a variable. And then you can just debug that variable, and it will output it to the screen. So pretty much anything that you can run a show command on, you can output to the screen. And then you can just run a playbook and then pipe that into a file. Take that file into your boss's office and answer whatever questions they might have. And I'll give you a cool example of that coming up here. So the running configurations of an entire network can be backed up in a playbook. The role that I'm going to demonstrate actually includes backing up the switches into a file. So here's an example playbook for like a report. How many of you guys have actually used Ansible? Okay, so almost everybody. So you kind of know what's going on here, right? So for my hosts, I have a group in my inventory file named iOS. It's going to be my Cisco routers. Gather Fax is set to no because on the iOS there's no native Python. So if you're using Ansible on something like a Linux server, like on AWS or something like that, Linux server is probably going to have Python on there, so you can actually gather facts at the beginning of your playbook, and then it will know sort of who it's dealing with, and then you can say, hey, if this is a Red Hat server, then do this, and if it's not, then do this. But with iOS, there's no native Python, so you're always going to have to set gather facts to no. Connection is local because it's actually this machine that is going to be SSHing to these devices. So we're actually running this playbook on this machine because it's the one that's going to be opening up that connection. So for the tasks, we're including our secrets.yaml file, which is going to have the SSH username and password for our Cisco switches. Provider is actually a dictionary that basically in the secrets.yaml file, the auth pass, username, and password are all variables set in there. So that's how it's able to gain connectivity over SSH. So for this one, we'll say get serial model and number. Now that's just the name here. That's just human readable, so you can set that to anything you want. The module I'm using is iOS command. Provider is saying, hey, use these credentials to SSH in there. So we're going to say show version space pipe begin model. We're going to register that as version. So now we've created a variable named version, and then I'm saying debug says show me version, and then send it to the standard output of the screen there. So it's going to look something like this, right? So if I was to run it on one device, which is one of these is 161.9, it's actually showing me the output of that command. Now I could run that on 40 different switches at once, however many are in my host file in my iOS group. And I could pipe that into a file, and now I have a list of the model number, the configuration register, the serial number, all that stuff. So widespread configuration changes. Now I think this is how everyone sort of gets started with Ansible. I think this is what kind of piques your interest at first, because everyone's used to having to make a change. So let's say you have an NTP server that goes down, and now they've replaced it. So now there's new IP address out there, right? So that change needs to be made on every single one of your switches. Well, in the past, you'd SSH to each switch, and you would change that, and you miss one or you miss two, and then when you log into these switches, oh, hey, look, this one still has the NTP server from 5 years ago or whatever, right? So I could easily write a playbook that just executes that NTP server command, changing that IP address, and run it on all 40 or 300 of my switches at once. And I mean, that's something that's going to take you like 10 minutes. From writing it, to running it, to then running a report to verify that it's been done, right? Like that's a 10-minute task. So other things you can do, adding a few lines to an access list. Pretty much every single switch and router has an access list that limits the SSH connections on the VTY lines. So I mean, everyone's going to have a use for that. Security upgrades. So one of the examples that I like to use here is, I don't know if you guys noticed when WikiLeaks dropped that Vault 7 leak, there was actually a Cisco exploit listed in there, and it said that, due to this cluster module, even if you didn't have this cluster module turned on, but they were able to exploit that. And if you allowed telnet connections, they could reboot your device, right? So that's not good, right? Especially, can you imagine an ISP that I can turn off any of their devices whenever I want, right? So what you can do very easily is just run a report and say, show run space type begin VTY, and then make that a var, type that in, run that on all 300 of your switches. You have a little report that shows you the VTY configuration on all of your switches, and then you could write a simple playbook that says, hey, you only allow SSH on my VTY lines, and then you could then run your original report playbook again. Show run space pipe begin VTY. Now you have before, then you have your playbook that changed it, and then you have a report for after. You can take both of those in, put them on your boss's desk, and say, look, here's where we were vulnerable. Here's how I changed it. And you could do that on 300, 400 routers in a matter of a half an hour. That's including writing the playbook if you know what you're doing. That's very simple to do with Ansible. So just some stuff for you guys to look at out there after this. I do have a little YouTube channel where I have some small videos that I made like a year ago on using Ansible as a network engineer. Nothing very in depth, but it's a good place to get started. So I am going to do a demo of this role, and you can find this role that I'm going to run on my GitHub page. So we're going to look at that so we can see what exactly we're going to change. And if you want to check out my GitHub page, it's just Colin-Mccarthy. So does anyone have any questions before we get to the demo? No? Okay, cool. So I'm going to have to switch over to a different lab, or a different Wi-Fi network.
So you could integrate these playbooks, you could integrate the networking with playbooks for server storage, applications, you could make it kind of contiguous. Because if you were a server admin or DevOps guy, you get up to the point where you needed to assign an Ethernet port to a VLAN and you have to stop, submit a ticket, right? Now you have one script that could, one playbook that could span the entire lifecycle and the whole breadth of infrastructure.
And one of the things I think is cool, and it sort of falls under sort of the DevOps mentality that people like to talk about, is in DevOps, you're sort of bringing together your ops guys and your developers, right? So instead of the developer guys throwing this over the fence and saying, hey, this works on my laptop, make this work in production. You know, these two guys really don't know a lot about what the other ones do. And they don't usually communicate. They're usually in different buildings. They eat lunch together in their own little groups, right? So sometimes that same thing can happen with sysadmins and network engineers, right? The sysadmins are like, I'll do whatever, but I'm not logging in any switches, right? And then the network guys are like, yeah, I'll work on the switches, but those Linux servers, that's your business, right? So one of the cool things is you can use Ansible in both of those departments, right? You can automate Linux servers, you can automate switches and routers. And now these guys, if they do bump into each other in the lunchroom, they can kind of know, they can kind of have some common ground. They can kind of talk to each other like, what are you doing? Oh, I wrote a role for this router. Oh, I just wrote a role for AWS so I can provision all these servers, right? And now we can start bringing these guys together. So hopefully that'll happen. So here I'm on the Cisco lab. Let me just check my connectivity. Actually, let me jump back over and show you guys this role that we're going to run. So I kind of just named this one Cisco base. So this is the README file for it. So here's the example running config. And this is something that you might put on a switch like I was talking about. You might have a Word document, and the network engineers are going to paste this stuff in once they have SSH Setup. And, so you have all your AAA configs, and you know, you might be setting up some basic OSPF here. You might have a ton of SNMP commands that need to go in there, for, you know, so you're not going to start monitoring and getting alarms. You could have a login banner. And then here's your VTY lines, right? Like you might say, oh, I only want transport input SSH. You know, I only want to make sure SSH is enabled, no telnet. Here's my UTP server. So these are the kinds of things that people are putting on new switches on a daily basis, right? So what we're doing here is we have our hosts file, and this is our inventory. Inside of that, we have one group. This is just a small example. I'm actually going to do it on four switches today, but when I wrote this, I just kind of wrote it for two. So you have your host name, and then you have a couple host bars there. So Ansible SSH host, and then Ansible network OS equals ILS. I wrote that in there because one of the modules I'm using is a vendor agnostic module that they sort of just introduced. So previously you have ILS modules and GNOS modules, but now they have network modules, right? So it's vendor agnostic. So as long as you have a host bar that tells you what vendor this is, that same module will work on any of them. So here is our vars main.yaml. Basically just have like some key pairs here going on. So these are all the things that you can change. So rather than going in and changing your whole role, you could just come to one of these variables and say, hey, the boss said no more SSH timeout 60, that needs to be SSH timeout 30. You just come in here and change that, and then you run your role, and all your switches are exactly the same, and they're all on 30. Feel free if you guys have any questions about any of this before we run it. So I just have a bunch of like sort of just document IP addresses in here. This obviously is a real config. We have a log server in there, an SNMP host. So you can see these are the kinds of things that I've variabilized. So they can be easily changed. I actually created a separate YAML vars file for OSPF. And the reasoning behind something like this is, let's say maybe you have one department that makes your BGP changes, right? And then maybe you have one department that makes your access list changes. And you have another department that makes your base configs, right? That's maybe your NOC guys are one of the base configs. But we don't let them touch BGP yet, right? You get their BCPs and sort of maybe move into this department. So what you can do here is, I can make changes to the OSPF file without ever touching the base config file, right? And then if something breaks, we sort of compartmentalize that, right? So we sort of containerize this a little bit. So then I have another file here for the login banner. Kind of the same theory there, where if I want to make a change to the login banner, I'm not touching the entire playbook. I'm just only touching this one small file. So do you guys have any questions on this before we run this?
If you're using TACAX or something like that, you've got a username and password to log into things. You don't want to log in with a shared credential account. You want to log on as you, Colin. How do you preserve that password or username and password from being in your scripts so people?
Right. So there's a feature called Vault, right? And so you can vault the file, and then when it shows up, it would actually be encrypted. And I think you could probably do something crafty maybe with like a git ignore kind of file too. You can ignore, you could put that into a secrets file and then you can ignore that one. So any pushes maybe the repository wouldn't include that one. But yeah, Vault I believe is kind of what you're leading to on that one. So with Vault, it'll encrypt the file, and then you need a password to run the playbook. But yeah, if there's no other questions, we'll go ahead and run this one. Well, I still have internet access. I did want to show you guys, this is the Ansible docs page that lists all the current network modules that are supported. So you can see there's actually quite a bit at this point. We got Aruba, Cumulus, which I'm going to be doing some work on here pretty soon. We got some Arista. And these are the vendor agnostic ones I was talking about. So, in the past it might be iOS interface or Gmail interface, but now it's net interface, right? So as long as you have that host variable that tells it, hey, this is an iOS device. So they've written the software in here that will actually run on any devices that is specified. So that's interesting. You can kind of see maybe where they're going with it, where everything's sort of going to be vendor agnostic there. So here's our iOS modules that we'll be using today. We're mainly going to be using this iOS config and then using a Jinja 2 template from there. So you have iOS XR and Junos. Here's some more layer 2 vendor agnostic, Lenovo, Netcom. So, all right, if there's no questions on that, let me jump over to this other network.
So do you not use Fax or something to validate ahead of time that it's the right device and what you meant to do?
You could. There's a gather fax module, and then you could also you could write some logic into your Jinja 2 template that says, if this is a Cisco iOS device, do this. If not, then do this. You just can't specify the gather fax at the top of the playbook like you would with a normal Linux server.
You use iOS Fax, yeah.
Yeah, you have to use the specific gather fax module. All right, so let's take a look here. Like it's working now. As you can see,
We'll edit that
I have
out.
4 switches that are responding back. 14, 15, 9, and 8. And this guy's number 4. So let's see if the playbook will run for me here as a roll. Cool. See if we get out of it. Okay, so yeah, this was the playbook I ran right before you guys came in, and then we're fine. Okay. All right. So this one I just have named test. We can take away that if you want. So it's pretty simple. Just naming my host group, GatherFax is no connection local. I set this to serial 1, just to make it, maybe try to run a little bit smoother in case we have any issues. What that does is, instead of multi-threading and trying to sort of open the SSH connections and run it at the same time, just do one at a time. I can set that to, but I'm just going to have it do one at a time, and so you'll see as it runs, you kind of see what that looks like. All right, so it's basically grabbing that secrets.yaml file. It's defining that provider dictionary. It's making a backup and kind of showing you the directory that it's making, where it's putting that backup. Okay, so that large base config has been put on switch number 9. The login banner has been put on there. Okay, the access list has been put on. Now we're moving to switch number 4.14, making the backup. And if anybody brought their Mac and you want to log into these and kind of check it out, once JB is done with his, we can run some playbooks on these and you can kind of watch and change if you want. Okay, the config template has been applied to switch number .14 banner. So there's a second role I included in there to put on the access list. So now you switch to .15, we're making a backup. You guys have any questions? You can kind of see what's doing there.
What module did you use for banner? Just iOS config?
So I use the network banner.
Okay.
So that's why in the host bars I set that one up to just to have that host bar that identified as iOS because I'm using that network agnostic banner module. So yeah, this role you guys can git clone it and basically use it in your own networks if you want. You just have to maybe change the bars in there to match your stuff. And the final one, 88, now has the base config template applied, the new banner. And
So
the
does
access list.
Ansible support any type of checksumming at all for any of the configs, so to make sure they tamper stuff?
No, I'm not sure.
Okay.
So yeah, here's your play recap. Everything looks still work good. We can log into one of these devices and take a look here.
Looking at the commands.
So now you can see it's giving us the
Yeah, it was more about the actual files than checking the files before they're pushed.
like
So
MD5.
config, yeah, like a config file, just to make sure they're not manipulated. Just like he said, you might build these playlists and stuff and go away, and your knock guys run them, and being able to validate that, make sure they're not tampered.
The access.
So you can see it's put on all those AAA configs. It's set up to name servers. So it's kind of going slow there. So I didn't include anything for the interfaces, but you could certainly write a Jinja 2 template for your interfaces. Because this isn't production, I didn't really have any desired state that I wanted my interfaces in. But let's say if you don't want them to be layer 2 dynamic desirable, maybe you want to no switch port and lock them all down, or put a description on there that says available or something on all your new switch ports. You could definitely do something like that. So here you can see I put a little access list on there. I'll put all those SNMP commands and then this little login there. And have a little MTP server that I put in there. So yeah, you can imagine doing that on as many switches as you want. Let's say you need to deploy 30 new switches, right? If you did it this way, they'd all be exactly the same, right? There'd be no fat finger, even mistakes in there. And it'd actually be done pretty quickly. And then you can save this role, document it, and share it, right? You might have another department in Indiana, and they have 30 switches. Well, you just say, hey, go check out the Git repo. You don't even have to write this, it's already been written and tested, and then all your switches would then right? So, cool. Well, thanks for bearing with me. I'm not sure what happened with the network connectivity there.
Yeah, can you show the rows that you call them subsection rows? Maybe that we also use for the rows that you call them in your test.
Sure.
That we just get an understanding of what these rows are doing.
So for this one, I called the base and the ACL. So we can look at those here. So inside this role, you have these directories here. Most of the work here is being done with Jinja 2 templates. Mainly this one I'm hardening here, so you can see here's all the commands that we were entering in here, and the variables are mentioned in here, and of course those can be found in that variables directory in the main.yaml. And then, so here's kind of an example. Let's see here, so at the top here, I was debating on making this like a multi-vendor role because I do have some Juniper switches. So I put in here, for host in group iOS. So this is basically a for loop that says, if you're in group iOS, do this, and then down at the bottom, it says if you're not in the iOS group, do this, right? And so I was thinking about making a Juniper group, and then putting all the Juniper commands in there, and then you could run this on 4 Juniper switches and 4 Cisco switches with the same role, and then it would identify based on what in your inventory file which commands that it should enter in. But I figured this would be good enough for today, right? So let's see, we can probably look at that access list one too if you want. So. So I think this one I did in the tasks. In this minute. Because there is a module for access lists. So yeah, I just did this one in tasks rather than using a Jinja 2 template, because for access lists it seems to work a lot better because you have like parents and before features and stuff like that you can use. So like this before is saying like, hey, delete the whole access list before you start configuring the new one. So that says whatever is in my configs here is exactly what I want to show up. Because if I didn't delete that, then it would add 10, 30, and 40, but if 15, 60 were in there, it wouldn't have deleted those, and then it wouldn't be in the exact state that I'm sort of declaring them. So yeah, this was the second one that I did. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Well, does your work or the playbooks you've written, do you have a certain bootstrapped config you typically expect or presume? Like,
Well, with Cisco, so you have to have SSH connectivity set up, right? So that's what I'm gonna presume that we have set up. Like IP connectivity and then SSH is set up. Because if we don't have that, we can't communicate with Ansible, right? So that's where it gets interesting, right? Because it's like a lot of people want to do like zero touch provisioning using Ansible. It's like, well, you're gonna have some sort of a way to get SSH connectivity on that device, right? So if you're using something like Cumulus, that might be a lot easier because it's a Linux server, so it might be able to come up with SSH connectivity, right? But an old school iOS server like this, you're gonna have to figure out a way to make that happen, right? Whether you have it somehow, they don't have zero touch provisioning scripts on like these older boxes, but on the new ones they do, so maybe you call an expect script, it sets up SSH. And then with Ansible Tower, which I didn't demonstrate because it's sort of a sales pitching kind of thing to do at Ansible Meetup, and that's not what I wanted this to be about. But with Ansible Tower, it's actually a GUI, and it has an API that you can use. And so you can actually, if you write like a workflow template, you can check a little box that says, hey, give me a little URL, and then if this URL gets curled, kick off this playbook. And so you can put something like that into like a zero-touch provisioning script, and you can say, hey, I'm alive, I'm going to curl the Ansible Tower server, and then it's going to kick off whatever playbook I'm curling. And so, that's I think the future, and that's where this kind of stuff is going. But for right now, I think, a good start is running it on switches that already have SSH set up, right?
One thing that we also did was you can set up a VM and give to a VM. You can set up Ansible script to set up the DHCP server, a web server, and then generate all the files and load it in its proper location, so that based on Aquarista, because in the DHCP query, you give a serial number, you can assign what configuration you can. So, zero touch provisioning in Arista, you can have a DHCP server, have a web server, and have generated configuration. And using this, if you already have a serial number, you can assign that this serial number is this switch and this switch is this config, and you can set up all that in Ansible. It takes some work in the beginning, but once you have it, you just give that VM to that side. It makes it a promiscuous in the network, runs a laptop to the network, and the broadcast takes care of everything.
Yeah, a lot of the newer devices have that kind of feature, but the old school Juniper and Cisco iOS stuff, you can't really do that stuff at this point.
Or use console.
Yeah.
It doesn't have SSH enabled by default.
Yeah.
It doesn't even have a username and a password.
It doesn't have IP connectivity.
It doesn't have anything. You can ship out a USB file, probably config with just the basic SSH when you ship it out. And have it
Yeah.
connect. You can do net boot to this boot
Yeah.
page.
Yeah, you have to have some kind of solution for that. But I know like the new Cisco Mccarthy ones, they'll just call out to the cloud, right? And you can download their configuration based on that address and stuff. But there's still a lot of that legacy iOS gear like those switches out there, and it's not going to be able to do that kind of stuff, right? And some of the new devices, they actually have Python on them, right? And so Ansible, uses Python. So that Python, if you talk to the Python on your device, you get a lot more features out of that. But I think that's one advantage that Ansible has though, is because it is agentless. Like try to use Puppet. Well, maybe they've invented something at this point, but you can't do this kind of stuff with a lot of these other configuration management tools. Like they opened up all these devices when they came out with this stuff.
We can stack 50 switches at a time, and use a serial cable with a KVM. So somebody's sitting at a desk,
Yeah.
I hate to admit it, pasting,
Right.
copy pasting, but all you've got to go do is just move the serial cable
Yeah.
to each switch and do your variable changes. I'll do it manually, nothing fancy like this. But, for a cheap work study, it works.
Yeah. That's what most people
But,
have been doing.
I was deploying 6, 4, 10, 4, 14, so 20 switches. the work took longer time.
Yeah.
But once it was very beautiful, just to see everything just come by itself.
Yeah.
Whereas that, I mean, it uploaded the code, made the latest version, uploaded the configurations. I just had to sit there and just watch,
Yeah.
and just finish the whole thing,
Yeah.
just not validate everything is good.
The other one I was going to mention for zero touch, right, is OpenTable talked about it at Ansible Fest, and so they have a serial server like a 2600 router that has reverse telnet or SSH to each console. So you would aim your config and then whack it over to the thing. So
If you have console, then that works.
yeah.
Open gear, use open gear, then that's
That's it. Thanks, Colin.